everybody, and good evening. I think we'll get going bright and early, right on time. Thank you so much for coming out to this event tonight with Blackstone Library and Branford Land Trust. My name is Claire Hambley. I'm on the board of the Land Trust, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker, Jack Matthias, this evening. Before we do that, just a quick introduction to why we're here. I think you all know why we're here, because you are here. This is one of a sequence of events that the Land Trust has been holding this year as part of our Salt Marsh celebration. And as part of our mission at the Branford Land Trust, in our nearly 60 years of existence, we have the privilege of protecting a large quantity of land around the town of Branford. Uplands and wetlands and forests and shoreline and salt marsh. And salt marsh is the reason we're here this evening. This is part of our salt marsh celebration. And in particular, we're going to be talking about our project at Jarvis Creek. And before we go further down that, I encourage you, if you have not already been on our website recently, to pick up one of these cards at the back on your way out recently, on your way out at the end this evening, or to pick up one of these brochures. It's a good way to connect with what we do, what we're about, and our mission. And if you haven't yet renewed your membership or donated to the work that we do, we appreciate every small piece of support that you can offer, whether it be as a volunteer or whether you're able to make a donation of time or financially. Speaking of volunteers, I'd like to thank Dave and Marsh, who are sitting here at the front of the room this evening for the refreshments which they coordinated. Some of you have been able to help yourself to those already, and the rest of you will be able to go back and get some in a little bit. But now, without much more preamble, let me switch over to tell you a little bit more about our speaker and our topic this evening. So, first of all, this is Jack. Jack is a graduate of Plymouth State University with a degree in environmental planning. He's an environmental scientist and planner, first out in the state of California for 8 years, specializing in ecological restoration and sustainability, and currently program manager for coastal resilience with the National Audubon Society in Connecticut. He's also a former board member of the Branford Land Trust, so we're good friends, Jack and the Branford Land Trust. He helped the BLT conceptualize the grant application that is funding our marsh migration project at Jarvis Creek Farm. And tonight he's going to talk about the importance of salt marshes, such an important ecosystem, and some of the planning that is underway currently at Jarvis Creek Farm. The work that the Land Trust is going to be carrying out there is based on a grant that we've received from the Audubon in lieu fee funding program. And this program centers on Connecticut's wetlands, which you know are really, really important. All of the shoreline that we have, it's really important that we be able to protect the spaces that we can. Audubon is the program sponsor, and they receive fees. This is interesting because I hadn't learned this before. They receive fees from permittees where there are unavoidable wetland impacts, and then they transfer those fees, they use those funds to fund wetland restoration, enhancement, and preservation projects elsewhere. And this program is established and overseen by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So I would like now to hand over to Jack to begin his talk. There is going to be time for questions afterwards, until about, let's say, 7:40, 7:45 or so at the latest. And then the library would like us to all have vacated the building by 8 o'clock. All right, thank you so much, Jack.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Jack Matthias. It's so nice to see all of you here tonight. See a lot of familiar faces, see some family, see a lot of new faces. And thank you so much to the Branford Land Trust for hosting these events to bring the importance of salt marshes up to everyone's understanding. And thanks so much to the Blackstone Library for also hosting this event. Tonight I'm going to be talking about improving coastal resilience through salt marsh restoration. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about a project at the Jarvis Creek Farm. And for all of you who don't know, this is an aerial imagery from 2021 of the Jarvis Creek Farm area. So absolutely amazing property. I grew up going here, I grew up fishing here. Amazing example of tidal salt marsh here in Connecticut. It's a very interesting property. There's a lot going on here. It has a long history. We'll get into this a little bit about intensive agricultural use. It's now been conserved by the Land Trust, and now they're in the process of determining how to move forward with conservation. Per the agreement that they have with the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection, who gave them the money to fund this, they no longer can farm the property. It's part of the conservation restriction. So they're in a very kind of challenging moment in time where what's the plan for this that field that's been farmed for over 100 years? Do we just let it go and have it turn into an invasive species, or do we kind of come up with a new sort of innovative project to help the marsh migrate? So tonight we're going to cover, I'm going to give a little bit of intro about Audubon, Connecticut. I'm going to talk obviously about the importance of salt marshes. I recognize a lot of you from the walk that I gave a few weeks ago, so we might touch on that a little bit quicker. I'm obviously going to talk about the threats to salt marshes. They're in peril. They're drowning, and we're losing them very rapidly. I'm going to talk about a few restoration projects that I've led here in Connecticut, some very successful ones. Some ones very similar to the project we're going to be talking about later in the presentation, which is the Jarvis Creek project. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty there about what we're actually going to be doing on the property and what the goals and outcomes of that project will be. And then we'll have some time for a question and answer. So Audubon, Connecticut is Connecticut's premier bird conservation organization since 1943. They opened up, we like to call them sanctuaries in Greenwich, Connecticut in 1943, and it's the first example of a nature center in the United States at that time. So we do a lot of different things. I do salt marsh restoration for my role, but we do environmental education. We do a lot of policy and legislative work, a lot of advocacy with our legislators. We grant money. We also receive grants. We have 12 protected sanctuaries throughout the state of Connecticut, and totaling over 4,600 acres that we manage. So we have about 35 full-time staff, and ranging from someone who educates students all the way to an executive director that deals with national issues. The map on the left is just an example of our national reach. These are all little dots of either a property or a sanctuary or a center. So you can see that we're throughout the United States. The mission of the National Audubon Society is to protect birds in the places of need today and tomorrow throughout the Americas using science, advocacy, education, on-the-ground conservation. So at Audubon, we understand that we're all connected. So these little projects that we do up here in Connecticut, it's going to help a bird, for example, that migrates all the way down to South America. So we need to help that. If we're doing work, up here and we're completely ignoring the bird throughout its flyway, that doesn't really make sense. So we are really expanding into South America. We're opening up sanctuaries and running programs down there. We have offices in North Carolina and Florida. We track these birds with sophisticated tracking devices to kind of understand where they're going. So, yeah, the birds are pretty smart. A lot of them get out of here for the winter, so not a bad idea. Finally, this is sort of our guide. We have this plan called the Flight Plan. This is a major document that kind of guides Audubon on how we operate and what we focus on. A couple of the milestones that relate to the work that I'm going to be talking about tonight and the work that I do is we have this very lofty goal of 300 million acres to provide quality, connected, and climate-resilient bird habitat conserved. So the word conserved there means protected, like Jarvis Creek. It means restoration. It means basically creating and enhancing, protecting bird habitat. And also another lofty goal we have is 30 billion tons of carbon kept stored in forests, wetlands, grasslands, with additional carbon sequestered each year. So as we're going to find out here in a little bit, salt marshes are one of the most important carbon sequestration things that we have in our environment. It's like a carbon sink, they call it, because they just take in so much carbon. And when we lose that carbon, when we lose the salt marsh, the carbon is gone forever and gets released into the atmosphere. Causes global warming. So what is a salt marsh? I'm going to talk briefly about this. It's a coastal wetland that's tidally influenced by salt water. It kind of contains waterlogged and spongy peat with very low oxygen levels. That's that stinky smell you smell when it's low tide. The species that thrive there are specialized plant species that are salt tolerant and have adapted over millions of years to live there. And there's two types of salt marsh habitat. There's the low marsh, which Jarvis Creek generally is. It's dominated by Spartina alterniflora. It receives daily tidal flow. And then there's the high marsh, which is a little bit more rare of a marsh. It has more biodiversity in the species that thrive there. And this is actually where the salt marsh sparrow nests. I'm going to give a shout out to my friend here, the salt marsh sparrow. Its population is declining 8% per year, directly related to sea level rise by accelerating climate change. And the reason why that is because it nests in the grass, it nests down here. And what we're seeing with increased sea levels and higher high tides is that it likes to nest right after the lunar cycle, right when the tide is the highest. That's when it nests right after that, because it understands that the tide's going to be receding from that point on. However, because now we're seeing increased sea level rise, more frequent higher tides, it's not able to adapt and not able to figure out, hey, maybe if I go up a little bit higher, I'll survive. So adaptation like that, evolution like that takes a very, very long time. It's not happening fast enough with sea level rise. So its nests fail because they get flooded out. So Audubon is really, really focused on salt marshes, salt marsh restoration. This potentially could be the first species that goes extinct in North America due to sea level rise. So we're really focusing our efforts. There's also a lot of other birds like the purple martin, seaside sparrow, clapper rail, that also call the salt marsh home, that are also imperiled and declining. Benefits of the salt marsh. Let's see, obviously they absorb wave energy in floodwaters during storms. They remove nitrogen from septic tanks and from runoff from rain. They sequester carbon. They provide a spawning, nursery, and feeding grounds for fisheries and shellfish. And they provide commercial and recreation opportunities. I love kayaking out in the salt marsh, fishing in the salt marsh. And the amount of money, from an economic standpoint that salt marshes bring in has been quantified before. It's a very large number because all sorts of people travel, they take pictures of salt marshes, they kayak and fish and crab. So the benefits go on and on and on about the importance of salt marshes. So what is coastal resilience? Coastal resilience is what we like to refer as a coastline that's able to withstand impacts with less damage and quicker recovery. So if a big giant storm comes in and wipes out an area of coast, it's able to withstand that damage more, it's able to recover quicker, and it's more resilient. So the work that I do, restoring salt marshes and enhancing salt marshes, is to build coastal resilience. Some techniques to build coastal resilience is nature-based solutions. Two nature-based solutions that can be employed are salt marsh restoration and living shorelines, which are kind of building artificial reefs to slow down wave energy. We'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. Some other solutions that can occur that aren't really on the ground action is protecting land. And coastal retreat is one that we don't talk about because nobody really wants to leave their waterfront property and move away. But in the future, with sea level rise, some hard decisions are going to have to be made. some folks in some areas, retreating is the best option. And the only example of that happening is after Superstorm Sandy in West Haven, Connecticut, the National Resource Conservation District actually bought up several properties that were flooded so immensely during the storm, and that's an example of coastal retreat, is that those houses were purchased and we retreated away from the problems. And then advocacy and policy, going up and lobbying for nature-based solutions, lobbying for funding, talking to legislators, making sure they understand the importance of salt marsh as well. So salt marshes there's a lot of threats facing salt marshes. We have a lot of historic threats, such as the development of coastline. Here's a good example of that right here. This is a nice, beautiful marsh in Stratford, Connecticut, and there's a big warehouse right there this used to be salt marsh, and they filled it in and built a warehouse. Filling of marshes, I just spoke about that. Back in the day, salt marshes were kind of seen as stinky dumps where people just dumped their trash or whatever they wanted. So a lot of the degradation occurring is from historic dumping of things into marshes, dirt or trash or whatever. Changes to hydrology. Humans, for a very long time, have either ditched the marsh or controlled the water for farming, for mosquito control. All of this leads to invasive plants that have come over here from Europe and degraded habitat and took over areas that once were quality nesting zones for birds. And just human disturbance in general, just folks running big trucks around the salt marsh, or there's an airport over here flying over, and just general disturbance to the marsh. And what else? So current threats to the marsh. I talked a lot about sea level rise already. Here's a nice graph that kind of shows what's going on. As SLR increases, and the extreme high water becomes more relevant, the marsh is going to try to move up slope, and this is what we call marsh migration. It's Mother Nature's natural adaptation to sea level rise. As this water becomes higher over the years, the soil here becomes more saline. There's more salt in that soil. As this becomes more saline, these species are able to shift upwards and move away from the tide or the water. And then in turn, as this becomes more saline, these trees and shrubs that are occupying this transition zone, they will die and they will also move upslope. What's the problem here? What do we see? There's a house. All over Connecticut, all over the world, people have developed right along coastlines. And there is no room for the marsh to move. So these marshes are drowning out. And we're seeing that all over Connecticut, all over the country. Here's another simpler graph. Not only do the marshes have to deal with human development, also the geology of Connecticut in general is very challenging. We have a lot of bedrock outcroppings right along marshes. We have a lot of steep wooded areas right along marshes that they're going to be unable to climb up into as well. So marshes are just, they're in trouble. And are there some things that we can do to help them? Talk a little bit more about the salt marsh loss. This was an analysis done by the Connecticut DEP using some modeling techniques. We're going to talk more about modeling further down the presentation. In 2010, this orange represents high marsh in the East River in Guilford. The East River is a 300-acre beautiful salt marsh. They did some modeling and looked at sea level rise projections. By 2100, all of that orange will have turned into low marsh, which is the Spartina alterniflora dominated marsh. And that's sort of a high-medium prediction. The highest prediction is that all of that marsh by 2100 will be tidal flat, will be completely gone. So, as you can see, 770 acres will be reduced to 5 in 80 years if these predictions are accurate, which they're based on scientific readings. So it's pretty scary what's going on. And this is what it looks like on the ground. So what does salt marsh loss look like out on site? So here's a nice beautiful mosaic marsh. We have the high marsh, the low marsh. This is an example of the strictly low marsh, and then this is an example of a degraded site where the marsh has actually been drowned out from sea level rise, or hydrology, or the impacts that humans have caused. So back to some actions we can take, and Audubon has taken to restore these areas. One project that I led was a 44-acre salt marsh restoration project in Stratford, Connecticut. It was implemented in 2021 and resulted in over, I'll go to the metrics here in a minute, but this is one of my favorite photos because we have multiple pieces of equipment working at one time. They're removing Phragmites, which is an invasive grass, out of the area. That requires actually digging into the soil to remove the rhizomes and roots. You can't just pull out the plant, you have to actually try to get the rhizomes. And these white specks right here is actually snow. So salt marsh restoration projects happen in the winter. And the reason why they happen in the winter is because one, the ground is frozen, and this equipment can move around by limiting disturbance. And two, there's no birds nesting, and the disturbance to the flora and fauna is limited. So this is just, I love this photo. I'm here on site, coming down to the wire. We have those excavators out here. Contractors are getting all salty, and we're just getting work done. And we have to, do some pretty drastic disturbance to these sites to actually restore them. I love including photos of myself. Here's what it looks like afterwards. So this is one of the areas we regraded to a high marsh elevation. We planted salt marsh plugs here, and this is the first season of growth. This picture up here are actually soil hummocks. So we used an innovative approach on site that hasn't been done anywhere in the Northeast. And that is we actually brought fill in and created soil hummocks on the marsh platform in some of those degraded areas. We planted these soil hummocks with specific grasses that the salt marsh sparrow likes to nest in. So what we're anticipating is in 30, 40, 50 years from now, the water is going to be filled in here, and these are going to be little refuges, little islands for the salt marsh sparrow. It's a very innovative experimental technique. We're still conducting monitoring and data analysis, but as you can see, we've had really good success with the revegetation. So just to sum up the Great Meadows Marsh Restoration Project, it's 44 acres. We dug 2,000 feet of new tidal creek, created 14 soil hummocks. We removed 6,000 tons of Phragmites soil. We installed over 160,000 native plants. We've also liked to get the community involved in all these projects. So we have over 400 hours of volunteers helping us do the plants. We were actually able to pay 12 high school students to come on site and learn about restoration and do some of the work. Salt marsh sparrow has returned to the nesting area, and actually has, to this day, nested on one of the hummocks. And just a general increase in biodiversity. This used to be 100% Phragmites, and now you can see all the plants that we planted and the seeds that we placed down, and it's really turned into a thriving environment. The next project I'm going to talk about is in the planning phase. This is the project at Hammonasset Beach State Park in Madison. It's kind of the crown jewel of state parks here in Connecticut. It's over 900 acres. There's 400 acres of salt marsh here. Really beautiful site. You can see here. What's cool about it is the salt marsh is actually designated a natural area preserve. That means that people are not allowed to go into this area without permission. So they can go to the beach and they can ride their bikes, but they cannot go into the salt marsh unless they have permission. So right now, the work that we've completed so far at Hammonasset is we have 30% designs for a restoration project. And that includes, we're going to be replacing some undersized culverts at the park. and we're going to be developing a nature-based solution like a living shoreline to prevent coastal erosion. We've also engaged the community quite a bit with teacher trainings, field trips, and youth employment. So just to look at the issue happening at Hammonasset, so I want everyone to know, similar things are happening here in Branford as well. This is a 1934 image of the salt marsh at Hammonasset. You can see the ditching that's occurred. I think every marsh on the East Coast has been ditched. This is a very nice, we call this a barrier beach. This beach used to support the #1 population of least terns and piping plovers nesting in the state. They haven't nested there since 2015. And the reason why is because of this massive coastal erosion that's occurring. Over 30 acres of marsh has been lost at Hammonasset since this photo was taken, and we're losing about 9 feet per year. And it's accelerating in the last, if you look at the graph, it's in a different presentation, but it's accelerated over the past 20 years. So we have to think about this as a community. Do we sit back and let this occur? In my opinion, this erosion is likely natural, but not at the rate that we're seeing, not at the accelerated rate. So we're seeing more powerful storms now because of climate change. We're seeing wave energy directed towards this area because everybody else has armored their property. They have put up breakwalls, there's marinas, there's revetments. So all the energy is bouncing off everybody else's property and getting directed to the one soft place, which is Hammonasset. So do we sit back and just let this marsh erode away, or do we try something? Do we try to come up with a solution, a nature-based solution to slow down that erosion and kind of get it more in balance? Here is a nature-based solution that we are thinking about employing at Hammonasset. These are called reef balls. They're made out of sustainable concrete. They come in like a mold. They are placed in the intertidal zone. You can see them out here. And what happens is they reduce wave energy, and then sediment accretes behind them and actually builds salt marsh. So you can go see these reef balls. They're in Stratford, Connecticut. All of this marsh was not here before the reef balls. This has all been grown in after the reef balls. This is what we want to do at Hammonasset. We want to install some of these in a certain way to build back the marsh and actually have something to slow down the erosion. Will the erosion stop completely? No, that would be unnatural. We're trying to develop a system that works within itself and can kind of get back in balance. And it would be such a success if we were able to get a least tern or a piping plover to nest back out of Hammonasset, because they are no longer nesting here, and they're going over to the beach where all the humans are and causing all sorts of issues with off-leash dogs, beachgoers, and things like that. All right, so that's a little overview, the projects that I've implemented, why salt marshes are important. Now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty about the Jarvis Creek Marsh Migration Project. Here is the property boundaries of the Jarvis Creek property. Up here, for anyone who doesn't know where the Jarvis Creek property is, it's located here in Branford on the Guilford-Branford line. It's part of the Holdley Creek, Jarvis Creek watershed, which is about 140 acres. It's located on Route 146, which is a very scenic, historic highway. And it's about 20 acres, and we saw the aerial imagery of this field. Here's that salt marsh I was talking about, and it flows out to Long Island Sound. So it has a very long history of impact out here. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. To sum it up, Jarvis Creek was acquired in 2021. $500,000 is provided by Connecticut DEP specifically for marsh migration. That's what is the intent of the acquisition. So we have to do something out there in order to meet the intent of the acquisition as well. And also the local community kicked in. $1.5 million of fundraise. That is amazing that everyone realized how important this property was. Everyone came together as a community and donated over $1 million to get this property conserved. What also is really cool is it's part of a larger 1,000 acres of open space that's connected. So here's this green area is all conserved property, Westwoods, the quarry trails, the weed preserve, Stony Creek's over here. So now that this is conserved, it's just a really nice connected open space for habitat, corridors, for hiking, for all sorts of things. Here's a nice example of the trails that are out there. I really recommend going out there and taking a hike. And I threw this photo in there because I thought it was funny. In 2021, they were still cutting firewood out there, and there was an active work site. So it just goes to show what we're up against in trying to restore this property. It just has a long history of probably stuff spilling all over the place and compacted soil, and who knows what's buried out there. I love these 1934 photos. So here's one of Jarvis Creek, just to point out that we've been messing it up for a long time. I really love the photo of the railroad there because the train is actually going by. You can see the steam from the old train going over there. And one major piece of infrastructure that's really no longer viable but still there is the old trolley line. And that went all the way to New Haven and I think New York City at one point. So you can really see those nice linear ditches that were installed by the Civilian Conservation Corps, sort of a jobs program after the Great Depression for mosquito control and for probably farming purposes. Natural marsh has a lot of water that kind of sits on top of it. They're called those salt pans. And people, and they also breed mosquitoes. So the decision was made to ditch every marsh from here to Maine and down to Florida to get that water off and decrease mosquito habitat. So also during this agricultural time frame, a large berm was created by one of the farmers. We don't know who. They built this berm to protect their crop from marsh migration, from flooding, from saltwater intrusion, and we don't blame them. And from some initial investigations, the berm is mainly boulders and a lot of like organic material like wood chip and sticks and things. So what I'm hypothesizing happened is when they cleared this field, there was all sorts of rocks in there. I mean, we all know, we all dig here in Connecticut. You can't dig anywhere without hitting a rock. So those rocks had to go somewhere, where did they go? Oh, they got pushed to the edge here and they made a nice berm. So that's pretty much the extent of the berm. And so during thinking about this project and looking at some of the data, I did a desktop assessment, that's what we call it in my field, where I sort of gathered a bunch of data and a bunch of information to kind of understand the marsh migration feasibility here at Jarvis Creek. So the first place I went was the NOAA Digital Coast, and this information is free to the public, it's available. And I loaded up the sea level affecting marshes model. And the sea level affecting marshes model is a mathematical model that uses digital elevation data and other information to simulate potential impacts of long-term sea level rise on wetlands and shorelines. So this is a predictive model that you can look at any marsh, any area, and put up different information to see where the marshes are going to migrate in the future. So when I looked at this whole watershed, which is the Jarvis Creek, Holdley Creek watershed, it's about 140 acres, the first thing I noticed is there is nowhere for the marsh. Where's the marsh going to go when it migrates? There's a road here, railroad here, road here. This is very steep in here. There may be some areas in here, but the only area is this, which might have been salt marsh in the past, is at Jarvis Creek Farm. So, and the model agrees. when we look at the potential marsh boundary of 2055, you can see that this is the outline. I know it's kind of weird. This is the outline of what it's predicting the new marsh will be. It's not taking into fact the berm. The berm isn't part of the model. So if there was no berm here by 2055, it's predicting that that's where the salt marsh is going to be. So this is just a tool. Is it 100% accurate? Who knows? But it's just a way to determine, is there some scientific evidence, is there some data available that can show that the marsh is going to migrate where we want it to migrate. So we already talked about this. So marsh migration is feasible at Jarvis Creek. We talked about that. The INLEA program is sponsored by Audubon, Connecticut. It allows permittees to pay a fee in lieu of taking mitigation themselves. So what that means is, for example, there is a new bridge that needs to get built. And a wetland is going to be impacted by that bridge being built. They're going to have to build a whole new truss, and they're going to have to demolish a piece of salt marsh. So the Army Corps of Engineers says, all right, if you're going to disturb that marsh, you need to mitigate it. You need to build a marsh somewhere else, or you need to, create another wetland. So instead of doing that, what they do is they purchase credits through this fee program, and then somebody like Audubon can use that money that normally would have gone for a mitigation project, and we can fund projects like this. We can give it to the Branford Land Trust, other organizations. They can use it for projects. And one thing to note about this is they've received about $230,000 for this project. And so far we've hired SLR, which is an engineering consulting firm here in Connecticut, to help us design this project and get it permitted through the regulatory agencies. So they are the ones that have professional engineers on staff, hydrologists on staff. They're the ones that are actually going to create the plans and stamp them and get them approved by the people that it matters. So I'm very fortunate to have them on the team. They're a very great group of experts. So back to the project. Project goals is to remove a portion of the berm. We're not going to remove the whole berm, and regrade to allow for marsh migration. Within that, we want to create 1.5 acres of new salt marsh by potentially connecting to a tidal channel. In that area, we want to plant native plants to establish high marsh habitat. Here's a beautiful photo of high marsh habitat, low marsh, high marsh. This is what I'm envisioning it will look like. Controlled invasive species that reestablish. You can't walk out anywhere on Jarvis Creek without bumping into invasive species. They're going to come, as soon as we disturb this area, they're going to be coming in quick. So we need to stay on top of that to make sure they don't establish. And all the boulders that are in there, we're going to reutilize to delineate the parking areas because there's some off-roading concerns and some other issues happening on site. There'll probably be some fill too that comes out of here. There's some really giant piles of fill on site. Here's one right here. So we might redistribute that fill into this pile, or use it to regrade, or if we have funding, remove it off-site, which is really expensive. So another tool that I used during this desktop assessment to kind of understand the elevations and understand the project boundaries was LiDAR. LiDAR is light detection and ranging, that's what it stands for, and in 2023, the state of Connecticut performed a LiDAR flight in Connecticut where they did the entire state. So to put this in layman's terms, they fly a plane or a helicopter and they shoot little lasers and light down on the ground, and they record how fast it comes back up to the plane. And by doing that, they're able to capture elevation. It's very sophisticated and complicated, but that's kind of the quick and easy. So they do that throughout the whole site, and they can really get an understanding of the elevations, hydrology, aspect, and topography of areas. So through that work, they were able to create 1 foot and 5 foot elevation contour lines And they actually flew it during April and March. And the reason why they did that is, I know this tree has leaves, but they do it when there are no leaves on the trees, so it doesn't reflect as much back as quick. So there's people that can understand this a lot more than me, can probably talk a lot more intelligently about it than me, but that's what I was able to access was this data. So part of this LiDAR flight is what we call hill shade, which is, it shows the aspect and the topography of an area. And you can see how accurate this is because you can actually see the rows of corn on this. It's all this is right here. You can see where the farmer turned around in his tractor. You can see all sorts of things on site. So I loaded this up for Jarvis Creek to just take a look at the aspect, to see the berm and what it looked like. And we can really get a good look at the berm and what it looks like. There's that giant pile of wood chip and fill from the disturbance. There's 146. These are these tidal creeks and the ditching that has occurred on site. So it's kind of a really cool tool when designing this project, is we kind of, you're able to really see what it looks like through this hill shade data. So this is again, I loaded up those 1 foot contour lines from the LiDAR data. This is the existing conditions and the elevations on site. Here's the salt marsh, very low in elevation. Actually, this tidal creek right here is 0, 1 foot, 2 foot. That's 2 feet above sea level rise. So it's really, really low. All dominated by Spartina ultimiflora. And then we can see the berm. The highest part of the berm is actually 9 feet. And then it's about 8, 7 feet. Drops down here to almost level with the salt marsh. And up here it's about 4, 4.5. So you can really see the elevation of the berm here. And it's pretty drastic. I mean, there's almost a 6 foot of material right in here that's blocking marsh migration. So I did a little bit of kind of conceptual design through my desktop analysis. The yellow numbers are what the target elevations for restoration is what we're going to be targeting in this project. So we have our white ones, which are the existing. Those didn't change. We have our low, 1, 2, and then we're going to want to grade 3, 4, 5, and then connect with the existing elevations on site. This will allow a nice transition zone for the marsh to move into. We're going to leave the berm intact up here in the northern part. That's going to provide existing protection to the homes and to 146 in case there were any flooding concerns. So that should alleviate that. Potentially going to tie into this tidal creek right here, create a little bit of a tidal creek opening. That'll allow, during really high tide events, for the water to kind of come in here and start to make this more saline, as I talked about earlier. We want to create a nice, easy transition for this marsh to migrate into. And we're going to do a lot of planting in here, a lot of Spartina patens, Disticula spectata, Iva frutescens, and a lot of transitional species are going to kind of go on the edge. This blue area that I'm anticipating is the marsh migration area is approximately 1 acre. So it's a very small compared to the overall site of the project. What we're going to do with the rest of the farm is still in consideration. There's plans to turn it into a pollinator meadow, to do some native seed collection out here, to put cover crops to stop, the invasive species from marching right into this area. So again, this is a conceptual design. It'll likely change. I put this together, looking at all that data and then looking at the models. And but this is exactly what we need to do in order to get the marsh to have a nice, easy migration area. So this is what I'm hoping it'll look like. It'll turn from a cornfield into a nice, beautiful salt marsh habitat where we have really nice transitional communities, high quality habitat, a really shrub dominated area for birds and for wildlife, all sorts of specialized salt tolerant plants, and we, if anything, create a nice buffer from whatever is going to be happening in the field to the salt marsh as well. So there's actually been a lot of work already done at Jarvis Creek. We talked about the project and what might happen there. We've had all sorts of experts come out and kind of provide some expertise. These are some of the people that have visited the site. Branford Land Trust installed a new parking lot, which is very important because people are now focused in one area and not driving all over the place. We've led several education events. Yale's Evolution program, after-school program for at-risk youths, comes out to the site and they all learn about salt marsh education, and there's been all sorts of work parties. And controlling invasives, dumping wood chip, you name it, they're all over it. So hats off to the Branford Land Trust and their stewardship team for getting out there in such a timely manner and conducting the work. So go back to that in a minute. Let's talk a little bit more about the project. So likely what's going to happen is, once we get approval from the state of Connecticut and the Army Corps of Engineers through permits to do this project, they're going to come in with like an excavator. The first thing they have to do is sort of mow the top of it and get rid of all the vegetation because you can't even see. This thing has so much phragmite on it, you can't even see what's going on. But there's plans this winter to mow that phragmite so we can take a better look at the berm. And then you would come in and the first step would probably be to remove all the boulders, pull them all out, and anything else we'll find in there. I'm excited to see what's going on, and start moving that around on site, and then having another team come in and regrade it to these elevations or whatever elevations are determined by the engineering firm. And then potentially connecting it to a tidal creek. And again, these are conceptual designs, so they might change. And finally, here's some stuff we all can do to practice conservation at our houses here. You can share what you learned today and with others. You can volunteer, especially with the Branford Land Trust. You can engage in policy and advocacy with your local governments. You can support these specific bills that are in the House right now. These are nature-based solutions bills that are actually being considered by the Connecticut congressional staff to promote nature-based solutions. You can maintain your septic tank. That's probably the biggest disturbance along Island Sound is septic tanks. Just outdated ones and the nitrogen that runs off into them. Organic lawn care or replacing lawns with native gardens. Lawns are, a thing of the past in my opinion, and I could go on and on about my dislike of lawns, but planting some natives around your house, just finding a little area and putting some pollinators down and trying to increase the biodiversity of your house is a very smart idea. Maintaining the storm drains around your neighborhood. They all drain somewhere, and usually it's into Long Island Sound. And skip the car, bike, bus, or walk. And anyone who lives on the water and is dealing with coastal resilience issues on your own property, consider a nature-based solution such as a living shoreline and trying to soften up your coastal frontage. Studies show that they're just as successful as hardening, as protecting your home, and they also provide habitat value, and you're not passing that energy off onto somebody else. You're actually absorbing some on your property, so it's a very conscious, sustainable thing to do. And that sort of wraps up my presentation. I hope there's some questions about the project and anything else I talked about. I'm happy to entertain those now.
Can you go back to your project?
Sure.
Two questions. One is, have you considered, what's the possibility of taking a higher area from like 7-foot elevation up to 10 and bringing it down to allow an expansion of the area that's potentially by Marsh? That's one question. The other question is, what do you know about studies? I know there are some studies that are looking at the possibility of actually raising up the low marsh areas by seeding it with material over time to build it up, sort of following sea level rise.
Can I just check, can everyone hear the question? Do you mind rephrasing as you speak, Jack?
Yeah, sure. What's your name?
Pardon?
What's your name?
Peter.
Peter. Peter asked, was there consideration into regrading, is it these areas?
Right.
Regrading these areas to a lower elevation or a higher elevation?
Lower, to get them down into the 5 and to 7 foot.
Down into this area. So that hasn't been considered quite yet. The scope of this project and what's been funded by Audubon is 1 acre. You know, to be honest, I would like to see this whole field turn into a salt marsh and actually add channels and do an actually really innovative project, but we're taking a very tempered approach to start. First thing we're going to do is get approval and remove this berm and do some grading. As that progresses and we start to see some benefit from that work, we could expand on that in the future and maybe do some actual more regrading to promote more of the site into a marsh.
Are there any environmental issues with doing that, taking that approach, of dropping down the edge?
The only consideration I would think is there are a couple of residents, people that live right nearby, and there is 146. So we would have to really work with the residents and the state of Connecticut to kind of, you know, understand how the water is going to be moving into that area once it's regraded. We feel pretty confident, you know, sticking to the small footprint right now. We kind of understand the flooding regime in Branford. And actually I had a quick conversation with the engineer at SLR, and he was telling me that during a 100-year storm, which is equivalent to the one that happened in 1930, so I guess we're coming up to one, that the flood level here is about 12 feet. So that's where it would flood to during the most massive hurricane you could ever imagine that never really happened. So the flooding concerns are pretty minimal. You know, we need to look more at the analysis. We need to kind of study the tide more. That's why we hired the professional engineers to look at all that and come up with a plan. I'm all for it, but the other issue would be we would probably have to get additional funding, and I don't think our grant that Branford Land Trust has would be able to fund any additional work. Your other question was, am I aware of studies to build up the low marsh in certain areas? So what you're referring to is called thin layer placement, and it's a salt marsh restoration technique where you actually take material and you spread it onto the marsh in the existing platform. There's 2 ways of doing that. You can do that with a high pressure hose, where you're actually dredging the material from somewhere else and spraying it on, or you can actually drive it out there with an excavator and then spread it out manually, which I'm not really a fan of. So thin layer placement is a very, it's widely used in the southern part of North America. So down in Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida, they do it all the time. It's not even a blink of the eye. Up here in Connecticut, we are working through some regulatory issues around thin layer placement. There's the way our permits are designed up here, and the way some people think is you're actually filling in the wetland. So you're not going to get a permit for filling in a wetland, but that's not what you're doing. You're spraying out a thin layer of material that will build up the marsh elevation and allow for vegetation to grow on top of that. So I'm aware of those studies. That is a consideration here, is if this sediment is clean and old Farmer Joe didn't, spill a bunch of diesel gas out here or whoever in 1920, and this is clean and it's the right size, maybe we could just use the material that we from the berm and just place it out here. So it's a very innovative idea, and I like that idea.
Can you talk about the funding a little bit more? If I got it right, it's a $230,000 grant that the state has given Audubon, and then Audubon will be giving to the land trust to accomplish the work.
So it's not the state, it's the Army Corps of Engineers. So we refer to it as Audubon, Connecticut sponsors this in lieu of fee program for the Army Corps of Engineers. So there's all sorts of in lieu of fee programs all over the place, in Maine, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania. All I can explain it is that permittees, people that affect wetlands somewhere else, they purchase these credits, and they call them wetland credits. And those build up in what we call a mitigation bank. And the funding, every time someone purchases a credit, the amount of money in that bank goes up. That amount of money gets to a certain level, let's say $500,000. Audubon, Connecticut then reaches out to the public, to the community, to Branford Land Trust, to Guilford Land Trust, to whoever's interested, and goes, hey, we have $500,000 of this mitigation funding. Do you have any projects? And then Branford Land Trust, for example, put together an application, and they competed against other organizations that were also interested in that funding. This project rose to the top because it was the most valuable conservation investment we could make with that money. So we compared it to several other projects. Some weren't that great, some were horrible, others were really good, but just not as good as this one. So the Branford Land Trust, I guess you'd say, they won a competitive grant from Audubon, Connecticut, utilizing these fees, and they came up with a budget, and they came up with what the project would cost, and that's where the $230K came from. So that's the amount of money they asked for.
So the land trust, did they do an engineering study first to see that the $230,000 is what the cost of the project would be? Because it doesn't sound like a lot of money to accomplish that.
It's not a lot of money at all. You can spend $230,000 like this doing salt marsh restoration. The Great Meadows Marsh project is $4.5 million, and we could still spend more out there. So how we came up with that money is a team of people, including myself, helped kind of determine what that would cost. So we have people on the board of directors, other industry folks that know about projects, and that's what we were able to come up with. There wasn't, in the mitigation bank that was available, there wasn't like $5 million to ask for. There was only a certain amount of money that was available. So we're hoping to utilize the state of Connecticut's wetland restoration crew to perform this work, and they do work very cheaply. And if we get in there, we start doing more analysis and studies, we find it's going to be a lot more money. What we will do is file for an extension on the in lieu of fee funding, and then we'll apply for other grant funding. And the fact that we have this money already lined up, $230,000, that's going to look very competitive to another grant opportunity. They're going to go, wow, we already have $230,000. We're going to match that, or we're going to give you $500,000 to complete this project. So, if anything, getting that initial $230,000 and starting to do the design, thinking about the work, it's just kind of starting the snowball. We're starting to build it and get it bigger and stronger. And When we fundraise for the Great Meadows Marsh Restoration Project, we have over 20 different funders. And we didn't get all of the money until that project was shovel ready. So people want to fund projects that are ready to go. And you need to get them ready to go by getting initial funding like this to get them started. And once we get in there, we realize, hey, we want to expand this project, or the boulders are too big for the equipment that we have, or something like that. We're going to apply for more funding and grant opportunities. And that's something I do in my role, is locate funding opportunities and apply for them. So, I hope that answers your question. You in the back?
I was just curious, say on the projects you completed, like the Great Salt Marsh project, what's being done? I know invasives are going to come back again without active intervention. How is that handled, and the cost of that on an ongoing basis, so that it doesn't revert back to where it was?
It's a good question. So we are actively managing the invasive species that are reestablishing at the Great Meadows Marsh project. We call that what we refer to that as adaptive management. Adaptive management is actions you take after the project's completed to ensure that the restoration goals are met. So when you're doing a project like this, or any project, or managing any project, it's not going to go right. There's going to be issues, there's going to be problems. There's not one project manager alive that says, oh yeah, I completed the project right. No, that's not the way it works. You get out there, you get on site, and things occur. So we have a contract with an invasive species management company, and they have been aggressively treating the invasive species for the last 2 years, and we've seen a vast reduction in the amount that are reestablishing. That was the other reason why we planted so many plants out there, over 180,000 native plants, is to provide some competition to the invasive species. Some people in restoration, salt marsh restoration, will go, don't do any planting, just let it come back naturally. And we can't do that. So try to establish a native vegetation, fight off the invasives as they come. We have been able to fundraise adaptive management funding because there was such a large conservation investment in that project, $4 million. If someone gives you $4 million and then you go, $4 million is, we're going to need like another couple $100,000 to make sure that that conservation investment rings true. They'll generally give it to you because they don't want to see their investment go to waste. So. The other thing you do in large-scale projects implementation is you always have contingency funds. So if the project was $4 million, we had 10% contingency funds just sitting there in case issues occur. One issue that did occur out there is we couldn't see the project site because the phragmite was so tall. The contractor came out and he said, I'll give you a bid, but I can't see what's under the phragmite. So when we got out there and started actually regrading the project, there was massive piles of boulders that no one knew was there because they were buried by phragmites. And that wasn't in the scope of their contract. They said, we're not going to move these boulders. We're not hired to do that. I'm hired to regrade the marsh. So then you kind of squabble with them, and then you use your contingency funds to do a change order, and you get them to remove the boulders. So it's all sorts of challenges, and definitely anticipating some out here when we get into this work as well.
Thank you for a great talk, by the way. I walk out there quite a bit, and I noticed that we're losing cargoes along the marsh border. My question is, in your modeling, is there any way to tell how much the western edge of the marsh will be affected by the migration of the eastern border of the project itself?
Oh, this photo. So Gordon was asking on the western edge, he's noticed a lot of hardwoods dying. And he was wondering if they were going to be affected by the marsh migrating here. Are these the ones you're talking about, Gordon?
Yeah, some of those and farther down near the tide gate.
Target, yeah. So, I don't know exactly why those hardwoods are dying, but I'll take a gander that the sea level is rising and these species are not salt tolerant. And we call them ghost forests because they eventually will all die off. And you see this at a very large scale in southern states and other areas more frequently.
Is there any way to calculate how much the project will really lower the marsh levels enough to allow hardwoods to grow back and save those hardwoods?
I don't think it's going to lower the water level of the marsh at all. You know, if anything, it's yeah, I don't think it's got any effect on the hardwoods over there. So it's just going to we're going to a new marsh to grow right here. And, you know, the sea level is still going to rise. It's just going to have a very small area now for the sea level. Are there some other questions?
Yeah, thank you. And I was very interested in those beehive structures, the reef box, in terms of where those could be placed, whether those could extend,
Yeah.
sorry, what their name is. I forgot what to call them. But whether those, I grew up in Short Beach, right on the seawall, the main seawall, and I was wondering, is putting a line of those things out where we used to have holes and buoys. Is that a feasible thing? Is putting them around the marsh a feasible thing?
Potentially. I will say one thing, that every coastline, every salt marsh is different. So what's going on at Short Beach is different than what's going on here. A lot of analysis, a lot of studying, a lot of expert coastal engineering, believe it or not, goes into where these get placed. And I come from the school of, let's go out there and see what, put them out there and then kind of see what happens. But potentially, if you put these things out here, like I said, it would create all sorts of sediment behind it, and you can build marsh. Just like you can go to Stratford and take a look at this. The reason why the regulators like the reef balls here in Connecticut, the permanent and other things too, is it's kind of a joke, but you could go out there and remove them if you have to. That's what he's telling me. Right? Well, I'm going to go out here and place these. If these things start causing a huge issue, you could go out there and pull them out, and they like to hear that because they're not permanent. These things do break down too over time, so
That's very good.
they last about 10 or 15 years. So the thought is that you build the elevation behind it, you build this marsh, and then this marsh acts as the new wave attenuation device. These are no longer needed. The biggest challenge in Connecticut is a really effective way to use these is actually to put them a little farther out in the water so oysters can attach to them. However, our aquaculture department here in Connecticut is against that. They feel like that's going to affect the native oyster population. So it's a little bit challenging, but this is a great example. I can tell you that the concrete is a special blend to survive freeze and thaw. And yeah, you can either purchase them, they're actually made in Florida. Reef Ball is like a trademark name. They have all sorts of different ones that are different sizes. They're made in Florida and shipped up here. The other solution is you can actually build a mold and make them on site, and then you can place them yourselves. They actually make ones that you may be interested in that are smaller, that like 2 people or 3 people could go out and place them themselves. It's to do sort of smaller scale erosion control methods. These ones are huge, and they actually had to use one excavator, hand it to another excavator, hand it to another excavator, hand it to the fourth excavator, and place it. So it was like, that's how they got them out there, is doing that. So it looks simple, but there's a lot that goes into it.
We still got time for a couple more questions.
Go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, it's great what you're doing, really, it's heartening to see. You know, you said that, Branford Land Trust raised $1.5 million. And I'm just thinking about places like Bridgeport that don't have a well-endowed population that can, afford that kind of money. What happens to places like that?
That's a great question. And it is challenging because generally a lot of these areas are in affluent areas and are supported by affluent people, Madison, Guilford, Branford. I would say, and I'm not trying to get political, but there was a movement before our current administration came into place to support disadvantaged communities and provide federal funding to census blocks, to areas that were distressed. Looking at just the average income or the demographics and things like that. So there was a lot of federal funding available for distressed communities, vulnerable environmental justice communities. However, that tone has changed. But I think, focusing on those areas is really important as well. And, having places for all folks in all communities to go and see the salt marsh and make sure that they're healthy is important. So at Audubon, we definitely focus on that. And, like I mentioned, a lot of these projects are in affluent areas, but we try and provide field trips and other sort of resources to educators and community members to come and learn about them as well. So, but that is a challenge, and thank you for pointing that out.
On your previous slide, that was kind of an overview of the Jarvis Creek Marsh. I just wanted to see where exactly is this berm area on that map?
This is the berm, kind of that brown thing.
Yes, okay. And are those the fields that were cornfields, are those still privately owned?
Nope, this cornfield is all owned by the Branford Land Trust now. They got a 1-year extension, so this is the last year you'll see corn out there.
Okay. And do we know when that berm was put in, when it was built, what year?
I don't. I mean, you can look at the. Oops, going the wrong way here. It's sometime between. Where is my photo? There it is. Kind of looks like there's a berm there. I mean, this is completely clear. So the trees, the rocks, everything had to go somewhere, right? Kind of looks like there's a berm out there, but I don't know exactly when it was. Put into place. What I will say is that the sea level has risen significantly since 1934. So these folks probably weren't dealing with the same salinity soil issues that the New Age farmers probably in the 50s and 60s were dealing with as the sea level rises and the marsh was trying to migrate into the berm. So I would think that the berm is a little bit on the newer side, probably in the last 40 or 50 years, as the sea level was rising and the marsh was trying to migrate up into the field and he was losing more and more crops to flooding.
One last question? Anybody? Paul?
Yeah, what we show is the trolley line there was actually the New Haven and New London Railroad.
Oh, this one right here?
Which is, yes, that was the original railroad. Chartered in 1848, completed in London in 1852.
Oh.
And then the railroad was straightened out and double tracked and made it carry heavier loads.
Thank you for pointing that out. I just looked at that and I assumed it was the trolley because it was another trail line, but thank you.
Shoreline trolley, south of that, okay, the Connecticut Company trolley reached Stony Creek in, 1907. And sometime in the 1910s, the shoreline trolley continued to Guilford and points east, but that was short-lived. Was abandoned in the early 1930s, and now it's at Marsh Lake.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, the trolley line. Thank you for correcting this. I'll change that to another rail line. I appreciate the local knowledge. It is a little farther south here, and you can actually still kind of walk on it.
Yeah.
It is kind of the only area where you see some high marsh grass species because there's a little bit of elevation in the trolley. So thanks for that correction.
All right,
Thank you,
well,
everybody.
yeah.